Everything's pretty gloppy at this point. Some of my watercolor ground is on fairly thick. I like that because it gives me textury stuff to work on later. I like some parts of my painting to be smooth and nice for rendering, but other parts I don't mind to have a bit of roughness. So I do use hot press, but I kind of create my own bumpiness on it. Now, while this is drying, which is going to take a while, generally takes, like half an hour for this amount of watercolor ground to dry, I stick it outdoors in the bright sun because that helps it dry a lot faster. So it's going to hang out with my succulents and plants here for a bit, and I'm going to take a break while I wait for that to dry. I don't really have a ton planned for this piece. I'm just kind of going with it as it happens. So I've got my palette. I'm just going to take the colors that I actually have here, dried on my palette, re-wetting them, and painting that on. Let's see, I think I want to get some this buff titanium, maybe some yellow, brighten things up, and some blues, painting around that lantern because I want that to be one of my brightest spots at the end. Mostly I'm just trying to get water here tinted with a little bit of color, because now I'm going to take my Winsor & Newton liquid Indian ink and shook it up. Now this only works with this very specific brand. I always have people watch my videos doing this and then they go and buy some Indian ink and try this, and it doesn't work because not all of them are going to do this clumping, granulating effect that I discovered this particular one has. And I say this every time when I do these kinds of demos as well, that this is just one of the properties I discovered by playing around with mixing various mediums, and you can just try playing around with whatever you've got near you, whatever you've got on hand, and sometimes you can get some really cool results out of it, things that are unexpected, because it's not like it says anywhere on the packaging that this ink is going to do granulating textures, but it does. And I wouldn't have ever discovered that if I just hadn't happened to have a painting that I decided to toss some liquid India ink on. I don't even remember why I did that in the first place, but I did. I'm glad I did it. All right, now here we are at another drying phase. The early stages of my paintings, I always have a lot of periods where I'm just going to sit and let the painting do its thing while I go off and get a snack to eat, or maybe make some tea, or do some other time-wasting activities. Now what I'm doing here is I'm just bringing the liquid in closer to my lantern, because before I had this wet edge and then this sort of jaggedy dry area around the lantern, and if I had left that, the spreading pigment would eventually pull up to that boundary and leave a much harder edge. In fact, you can see what I'm talking about right over here along the wings. See, because I did not wet down the wings or the bird itself, and so of course the pigment only runs as far as there is liquid for it to go, and if you don't give it moisture, it's not going to spread into those areas. Same over here is what I'm doing. I'm allowing the pigment now to spread into those areas that I've wet down, and sometimes I'll even do it over here to soften the transitions. And then if you really don't want the liquid, the pigment to continue bleeding into those zones, dry it off. Just use a wet paper or a dry paper towel here. And over here I am just lifting a little bit to soften and smooth that edge because it was a little bit too harsh an edge. Same with these, although I think it's not going to be a problem in the long run. I think when I'm doing the painting of the bird, these are going to be darker areas anyway, so it won't be noticeable. Same with the head. It's going to be darker, so, or more intense pigment, so it won't really matter that I have some of this green bleeding into it at the moment. Alright, so like I said, now is a drying time, and I let this sit for another half an hour or so. Sometimes I work on multiple paintings at the same time so that I can have something drying while I'm working on a new one. Alright, we'll check this out in another half an hour. To make sure that my inky textures don't get obliterated when I do subsequent washes and layers, I take my Daniel Smith transparent watercolor ground again, and I just do a very light touch layer over the surface. And I'll sometimes actually water down my watercolor ground a little bit, just a little bit of water to it. It does not, having it diluted does not affect the effectiveness of the surface for painting on, but it does let me brush this over quicker. And I don't want to disturb the surface very much at all, if at all possible. So the less your brush actually moves across the surface, the better. Because if you move, you're going to start to disturb the ink and blend it. And then you lose this grainy effect that it has. So really I just want to dab it lightly over the inky parts. And the translucent watercolor ground means that I will be able to paint watercolor over the top of this, even though it sort of will fix the ink in place. I used to sometimes use what do you call it, fixative instead to do this. I would spray a workable fixative on top of the areas where I didn't want the texture to move. I don't really like that as much. The workable fixative actually, even though it supposedly is workable and you're supposed to be able to do watercolors on top of it, I have not found that to be always the case. It does tend to seal in any sort of porousness of the paper so that your watercolors end up just sitting on the surface of it and sliding off rather than sinking in. And I like the transparent watercolor ground a lot better for that purpose because it has a little bit of repelling properties, but not nearly as much as the so-called workable fixatives. So yeah, this is what I do instead. And this won't take as long to dry because it's not really that thick and gloppy this time. I just did some light touching with it. And so this will probably be another 10 minutes. So again, more waiting. Like I said, the early phases of my painting end up being a lot of waiting around. I think I would like to layer some orange and gold colors into this background and into the upper areas. You see, sometimes you have to be careful. These little bits of the ink, the dried ink, eat bits, because if you let them sit there and they're loose and you brush them, they'll leave these streaks. Not what I want right now. All right. Yes, there we go. Some yellow. And orangey gold colors. Yeah, this is the streaks I'm talking about. I didn't really capture all the bits under the clear watercolor ground just now, so that's what happens. This is just a glaze of orange and yellow tones. And I want to lighten up some of these dark areas of ink. I like some texture, but sometimes it is conflicting with my composition, and so I'm taking my white watercolor ground, diluting it a little bit, and then I can paint over some of these darker areas and lighten it up, but still maintaining a little bit of translucency so that you can see it through this layer. So all this is doing is lightening things up. It's making it not so much of this striking black over there, which I don't mind in places, but right now with a dark blotch of black here, it was really conflicting with the flow of the composition and how the bird is swooping down here. And it would probably be drawing the eye at the end of the painting when everything is all filled in, and when this is all painted and colored. This dark area would really be an attention grabber. So I want to lighten that up with a little bit of this white watercolor ground. This side, I like that. I'm not going to touch that at all. I think that side is perfect as is. I'm going to work on it some more later. And again, waiting to dry. This won't take as long either, probably maybe 5-10 minutes. Base layer wash on the bird's wings. This is quinacridone gold. Not super careful with this. It's just a base layer wash, and my borders are not super important, especially since everything's pretty messy at this stage. Now for the head and neck, I'm going to grab one of my older brushes because I'm going to do some dry brushing stuff. And dry brushing action is always kind of tough on the bristles. So rather than damage my new brushes, not that what I've been using so far has been any good brush. This is a $2 Zen Royal and Langnickel. Fairly cheap synthetic bristles. I use them as a all-purpose brush for stuff where I don't really want to worry about my bristles getting worn down or getting exposed to mediums like the watercolor ground, which can kind of get stuck up at the top and then cause the hairs to splay and things. So I keep a bunch of cheap brushes on hand for things like that. This one is just one of my older number 0 round brushes, and I am going to start the bird's head with some dry brush action here. This is a piece in the vein of my shadowy creatures with their shadowed faces and things. So I like to have this very soft edged shading done for the shadows. The dry brushing gives it this gently fuzzed look to it, like it's a little bit diffuse. And I love that texture, so I use it frequently for these shadowy type critters. I'm going to zoom in my lens a bit in a second so that you can get a closer look at this as I work. Here we go. Much closer in now, so you can have a front row seat to this. I want to keep my brush dry enough that it skips over the surface of the page a little bit, and water, moisture doesn't fill in all the gaps. It's a little bit like the feel of a colored pencil on this finely rough paper. It's sort of the feel for this, because it lets me shade the edges and soften things in this very gentle way. You see the little bits of white. That's from the texture of this paper, and this paper is not very textured at all. It is a fairly smooth paper. It is a hot press. I am using Canson's Moulin du Roi. And here's another, you can see my brush, it's nice and close up. I let the bristles spread out a little bit and sort of flatten. That flattened edge of it allows me to brush these strokes in. Because if it was just a single sharp point, for example, you know, if it was like that, if it was at a point, then it would be a lot more work to be doing this kind of shading. But with the bristles splayed out like this, it lets me cover more area. I mean, not that I am intent on covering large swaths of area. I am using a size 0 brush after all. You guys know me. Me and my tiny brushes and tiny palettes. That's just how I work. I always like small things, and I like working small. It's funny, over the years, I actually have gotten, I think the size of my paintings has sort of gotten smaller. I mean, I do some pieces as large as I used to, but in general, I work in a much smaller area. It's just a whole lot more detailed, even though the paintings are smaller. So I keep getting smaller and smaller, and they keep getting more and more detailed. That's just the way my brain works. I think the biggest watercolor painting I have done was 30 by 40 inches. That was the largest size paper I could find. Well, at least paper of the brand that I liked. At that time, I think I was using the Strathmore 500 series illustration board, which is different from what it is now. I liked that stuff a lot back then, but it's always changing up. Papers come and papers go. Sometimes I stockpile up on materials that I like because I'm afraid that it might go away, as I have found happens far too often with art supplies. You find something that you really like and you think, oh, I can use this forever. My search is done. And then it changes. Either the company goes away, they stop making the thing, or they change the formulation of it. All kinds of things can happen. You can see right now I've been working mostly in a bluish purpley toned combo of colors. I like to layer in lots of different colors when I do this, because it makes the shading just feel so much more complex. You know, just the way I love layering watercolors and glazes too, you know. Layering in watercolors is one of the magical aspects of watercolors, because you really just get an effect with them that no other medium ever seems to capture. There's a little bit of red there that I used. And there's just this beautiful complexity to layered colors. That's one of my favorite things about watercolors. Actually, I have a lot of favorite things about watercolors. Another thing is that you don't have to deal with nasty toxic fumes when you're painting. Having a very small studio space, that is a big bonus to me. I have worked in oils once upon a time, long ago, and I did enjoy that, but I never liked the smells and all the mediums, all the toxic things that you needed to use to paint and to clean and to do everything, every aspect of it. So yeah, I like watercolors more. Layering in, I think I'm going to layer in some more blue tones into the body area. Now I'm going to keep the body softly shadowed like this, and then the wings are going to be very bright, with brilliant plumage colors going over there. At least that's the current thought that I have. As I said, I'm not really planning this one. It's just sort of happening as it goes, and so I'm making color choices as they occur to me. Here, let's do a little bit of a wash, a base color wash on the wing tips. Here, I guess these are not the tips. I don't know technically what this part of the bird is called, the wing, but that part. Sort of the equivalent of the elbow joint on a human, right? Shoulder and elbow. All right. Yeah, it's a very light wash, as I always do with my base washes. What I want to do is just sort of set an overall color tone that I will be working within. Now I am going to do some underlayer color shading on the feathers. I'm using that same brush that I did for all the dry brushing. And I'm getting in to each of these little feathers, and where each feather goes under the one next to it, shading in some of the bluish tone colors for that. I'm going to be doing more washes on top of this afterwards for the highlighted color areas. So this is the shadowed color areas. And it's going to be combined with the colors that are layered on top. And as I move along the feathers, I'm probably going to shift to other colors as well. In this area, I am using mostly this brilliant blue tone. gotten some of the feathers in, not all yet. I tend to not work an entire area all at once, but I sort of do little parts and go back and forth. So at this point I wanted to do a wash of some orangey tones over that. I love the combination of these close to complementary colors, the blue-green and then the orange-red. It makes for this really stunning vibrance when you go back and forth between them. It happens with any pair of complementary colors. If you put reds next to greens, you will also get this sort of vibrating effect of the colors, because I guess your mind is trying to go back and forth between these opposites. But I love doing that for a beautiful complex tone. Okay, so really what I'm going to be doing at this point is doing a lot of back and forth of what you just saw me do. So a lot of dry brush shading of the little detailed feathers, followed by a damp, either just clear water sometimes, or else a light wash of some tone to layer some complexity of color on top of what I just did. So I'm going to be doing that back and forth. At this point I'm going to switch back to time-lapse because the technique of it is really the same as what I've just shown you, and it's just the process of filling in the rest of the feathers in this way. Gone a few times back and forth now with those feathery textures and washes. And now I'm going to take my finer tipped size 0 brush. This one has a very nice point on it still because it is fairly new. And I'm going to get the same color that I've been using, that aqua blue tone, and much more intense now though. And I'm going to add some choice shading bits, sort of the opposite of highlights, they're the deep shadow color tones, just for punctuation. Now the reason why I do that back and forth of dry brushing and washes is just like well, first of all, there's the color complexity that it adds by layering the washes like that, but there's also a textural complexity that results from doing that, because each time as I do the dry brushing phase, the lines are much more defined, the colors and the shading, right? And then each time I hit it with a wash afterwards, it diffuses that a little bit and blends it and blurs it. And then I do a subsequent layer on top of that, which builds up onto that diffuse layer now. And you just get this grade of details ranging from the most recent layer, in this case the current layer that I'm going to be doing, the topmost layer, down to the fuzzier earlier layers that you do. And you have this building up happening. I'm probably going to add a little bit of contrast color as well. I'm not just going to have this blue. Maybe a little bit of really bright orangey red as well, in some little bits of punctuation color. Layering all these colors like this gives it not quite an iridescent look, but a little bit of that feel. And in fact, when I am doing iridescent color, an iridescent sort of rendering, for example, like a pearl, like I've done in the past, or a crow's black wings, a raven's black wings, it is actually a result of a very similar thing as I'm doing here, where you take complementary colors and a whole array of colors and layer them on top of each other. And you don't layer everything over every square inch. That's part of the trick of doing this, is that you selectively layer. So in fact, if you were to look more closely at what I've got here, my orangey washes actually don't extend all the way up to these portions of the wings, or even up here. They're more, I have them concentrated on the tips and along the back side of this wing and over here as well, rather than over everything uniformly. Because if you do it over everything uniform, then you lose that sense of shifting colors. So you leave gaps and you leave areas where your glazes are not touching the previous ones. And as a result, you get this interleaving. Oh yeah, before I was talking about the largest size painting I did, I got completely sidetracked. That happens with me. I lose my train of thought because I start wandering off onto some other topic. Anyway, I was saying that the biggest size painting that I had done way back was probably one. It's called The Darkest Night, but that was 30 by 40 inches. Like I said, that was on Strathmore. And I frequently did paintings in that time that were, if not 30 by 40, I think I only ever did that once, at least with watercolor. I did used to paint even larger than that in oils and acrylics when I was in college. I was on these giant canvases that I had to stretch myself, and I hated stretching canvases. That's another thing I'm really glad not to be doing oils and acrylics for, not having to stretch canvases. Yeah, here I'm getting sidetracked again. What was I talking about? Oh yeah, the sizes. I used to frequently work in a range of, let me turn this around, get to these feathers on this side more easily. And I'm going to get my little tray out so that I don't accidentally get paint onto these areas or spill water. It's a handy little tray that I actually made myself to perfectly fit my palettes and my water. All right, yeah, so 20 by 30 inches was not uncommon for me to work in as a size back then. And in fact, when I did my tarot deck, I started that in 2004. And I actually really wanted and thought this was going to be a good idea to do them in the size of 20 by 30 inches each painting. You know how many paintings that is? That's 78 paintings at 20 by 30 inches. That's huge. I am so glad that I did not do that. Some part of my brain said that is not a good idea to do. I did them at 8.5 by 14. And in fact, even at that size, which I thought was pretty small at that time, and shrinking down the painting to an actual card size, which is, what is that? Let's see. This is a card. It's like what, 4.5 by 2.5 inches or something. Shrinking it down to a third of the size that it was painted, which to me did not seem like an unreasonable thing to do. Having worked a lot in the fantasy gaming industry at that point in my career, I was doing a lot of card art, collectible card game art, for Magic the Gathering and Warlord and Legend of Five Rings and so many others. There were so many card games then. There probably is a bunch of them still now. There were a lot of them that I was working for. I must have done card art for at least 10 different companies over the years. Anyway, those were even smaller when they were in published form. I mean, the final pieces of art for those cards, they were maybe 1.5 inches tall by 2 inches wide. They were tiny little, and yet the art directors requested a minimum art size of, it varied from one company to the next. I don't remember what all of them were. At least one company that I worked for, the minimum requested was 6 by 8. You could work much bigger than that if you want, and I frequently and usually did, just because if you work larger, you can, the piece looks better when it's shrunk down. Despite the fact that it was only going to be an inch and a half by 2, that's about twice the size of or 3 times the size of a postage stamp, just for reference. So yeah, doing art much larger than it is ultimately meant to be printed at was not an unusual concept to me. And so when I set out doing my tarot deck, I planned to make my card art much larger because I wanted the art to look really good when it was shrunk down. And myself, I am happy with how it looks, but I guess not a lot, but there are some people that complain every once in a while that the details are too hard to make out, and they actually complain about the fact that it looks like the art was done larger and shrunk down. And in fact, yes, it is, because it is impossible to do, not impossible, but it would be extremely hard to do art in my style at actual tarot card size. So 8.5 by 14 was what I settled on. And by the end of that stint, doing all those cards, I was really super glad that I had settled on that size because it took me 4 years of painting. I mean, it wasn't constant. I painted for the deck on and off over that time. Like I said, I was doing a lot of art for card games and various other games and magazines and books and things. And I think I even started writing my first Dreamscapes book in that time period. So I had a lot of stuff going on. And the tarot was what I did in the middle of everything else. It was kind of my in-between contract paying project work, because since I had not yet signed with a publisher through choice at that stage, I was not being paid for doing that art. And so it was a labor of love, a 4-year labor of love. And it was just something that I worked on in between other projects. You know, when I would have some contract piece that I was doing, and if I was waiting for the art director to respond to me about what changes they wanted or which sketch they wanted me to proceed with, then I would do a little bit of work on one of the tarot cards instead. And you know, each one, so I mean, it averages out to, I finished a card about every 2 to 3 weeks or so. But it didn't take me 2 to 3 weeks to do each card. I mean, it only took me, I don't know, maybe 2 days, 3 days if you count, you know, the brainstorming and thinking and sketching and everything, you know, to do each card. And then I would do the actual painting over the course of probably about 20 hours per piece. So it was fun. It was fun times. Every once in a while I think, I want to do another tarot deck. I need to finish that Oracle deck that I'm working on with Phil Bricato still. That is, yes, still in the works. I know every time I post one of those pieces again, people ask me, are you still doing this? Yes, I really do want to do it. It's just, I have so many ideas that I want to paint, so many things that I want to do, and there's just not enough time for it all. But I will eventually. I do fully intend to. I have not abandoned that project. I've done too many pieces on it to abandon it. I was kind of debating what colors to use for these feathers over here. I tried orange. I don't know if I like it, so I'm actually going to take water and my 1/2-inch flat brush and lift all of that, well, not all of it, but a lot of it, blending it into the background. And just brushing clean water over there and then dabbing with a paper towel. This is called lifting, when you remove colors from the paper after you have painted them. I couldn't decide whether I wanted to go with a shadowed dark color for these wingtips or else go for the opposite and do white so that the background negative space is the darker part of it. I think I might try that. I was going to use watercolor ground for that. I love pulling out positive space shapes with white ground. For some reason, the white on top of a blended background or textured background is really appealing to me. All right, that's lifted enough, and I like now that this brought some orange color into that zone. Now I'm going to take my white watercolor ground. I don't know if this is dry enough yet, but I'll give it a shot. Let's see, you need another brush for this. Which one should I do? I think I'm going to go for the one that I was using for the dry brushing, because some of these feathers are long and narrow, so I need something that can maneuver along those. Hard to tell yet if this is going to give me the effect that I want, but I think it is at a quick glance here so far. Doing these sweeping strokes with it that follow the direction of the feathers. Yeah, it gives it this very bright contrast to the rest of the colors that I've got going so far. So yeah, I think I like the white better than I did the dark tones for this part. I mean, if I was going to go with, logical realism, or I wouldn't even say realism because this is so far from that, but logic, the lantern is over here, so that would mean brightest points over here and deepest shadow up there, sort of flip-flopping things for the sake of composition and for interesting color and shape, which I am much more interested in than any sort of realistic aspect to this. I mean, I already abandoned that at the beginning with the shadowed head and face. Still, initially I thought that having dark shapes up here would nicely complement this lighter compositional section at the bottom here, but I've changed my mind on that, and I think I'm going to add darker tones to the background here even. Not quite so dark as to compete with down here, and in fact I might layer some more colors in down here to pull that, to make that more intense as well. Done with that stuff. Now I'm going to take a white gel pen. My Uniball Signo is my favorite. And use that to, actually I'm going to switch to the thinner one first. This one, it's also Uniball Signo. This is the Angelic. I think it's a little bit different from this one. It's thinner barrel for one. But the ink is also a little bit more translucent and the point is a little bit more fine. So I use this one when I don't want as stark of a line. I just want a little bit of lightening along edges. I use the other one when I want really bright contrast. You can also take water and blend these a little bit because they are not waterproof. So that means that you can actually paint with them a little bit while they're still wet. And that helps to blend it better as well, so that it is not just these white line marks. I'm going to do that on this other wing as well. Adding just the smallest bit of highlights. Oh, there's this other quality when using these gel pens. When you lift the pen up, so the end of a line, so you draw and then lift, that's an exaggerated example, but each of these little strokes is like that, right? Each one of them is a draw and lift. The point where you lift, there's going to be a little bit more collected pigment, brighter white. So I think about that also when I'm doing all my little brush strokes. It's part of the whole stroke. So where do I want those brightest little points to be? And sometimes if there is a little bright point where I don't want it, you can take your wet brush and blend it in a bit more. Now, I'm not sure if this is dry yet. It is not yet dry. I'm going to wait till that watercolor ground dries so that I can draw on top of it as well. Right now, if I were to try to draw on it, it just wouldn't work. It would just blend, and I wouldn't get the brighter white layering on top of it that I want. So I need to wait for a little bit until that stuff dries, and then I'll be able to do a little bit of feathery textures on those as well. So meanwhile, waiting for that stuff to dry, let's work on other portions of the piece. A lot of times when I'm doing these demo pieces, they're too small to be able to work on other portions while something's drying. But in general, when I'm working on a large painting, that's what I'm always doing. I actually don't have to have much downtime waiting for drying very often at all, because when the painting's large enough, there's always some other portion of it that I can shift my attention to while waiting for something. So in this case, this is big enough for me to do that. It's not that tiny. It's small, but it's not teensy tiny like sometimes what I do. And I am adding some more color to the negative space around these wingtips. That helps to have them really gives them some contrast and helps them jump out at you more. But you'll notice I'm not just painting with a glaze in these areas. I'm doing the same kind of soft dry brush shading that I did on the head. And this lets the color come in towards those light places in a way that makes those light areas seem to glow, because you're seeing the lighter glazes closer in towards the white. And I'm just shading all this in with an orange color. Here, pull this closer so you can see. That's the color I'm using here. I think it's quinacridone burnt sienna, I believe. I really like the intensity of this bright orange. I bought it when I was doing monarch butterfly painting because I kept mixing quinacridone gold and red, various reds, to try to achieve that really bright orange of monarch butterfly wings. And I was painting over 100 of them in this painting. It was this huge swarm of butterflies, and every single one I had to keep mixing the color because I kept using it up. I don't mix large batches at once. I just mix small batches and use. And so I finally got tired of doing all that mixing and decided to go look to find a suitable out of the tube color. And lo and behold, I found quinacridone burnt sienna. No longer had to mix my monarch butterfly wing colors. At least not the base orange. Still needed to mix a lot of things. There's always mixing. That's the fun part. I don't mind mixing. It's mixing the same color over and over again for a base tone that I do not enjoy. So all these places that are not connected in the painting, these areas, by which I mean, well, my painting is going to be framed down to that line. So anything above that is just stuff that's, I'm painting past the edges so that you don't see the edge once it's matted and framed. But there are places that are not joined up, like this corner over here with this and this and this. So when you're shading areas like this, you have to make sure that your color tones match up across areas. So right now, you see this is a little bit too dark for everything else. So I could either lift it and lighten that, or else add a little bit of darkened bits to my other areas so that they sync up. I'm going to take my orange tones, although I'm going to make it more yellowish, and I'm going to bring it down to here even. And the reason being is, hold on, let me finish painting this before I talk about it. The reason being, I want this orange color to have this scoop shape. Even though the bird is in the way for most of it, it still shows up over here in the background area. And my neighbor's dog is being really loud right now. I'm going to close that door so that you don't have to listen to the dog barking the whole time. I don't know if you could hear it on this video. I can hear it. Now this bottom corner, I want more green, a little bit more green in this. So I'm just doing a glaze over the bottom portions, bottom corners. Coming in close around that lantern, but making sure to keep that still lightest. Maybe a little bit of blue as well. It's kind of a peacock green, bluish tone that I've got now. And pulling it a little bit up the sides even. Letting that color close in, so the overall effect is this bright scoop in the composition, right? This is where the bright area is, and it's not even symmetrical. It's not like a U-shaped, it's an angle off like that. And that's the orangey tones in the bird itself, the details of the bird, and the outside area is this peacock blue toned part. A little bit of purple even. Things are dry enough now, all this, so I can now take my gel pen and do a little bit of feathery work in the watercolor grounded areas. Just a little bit for the feather textures there. And now I am going to work in this bottom background area. Mostly so far what I've done is I had texturing, the gold leaf and the watercolor ground, and then the layers of color, the washes, but I haven't really done anything intentional down there. Well, at least not specifically intentional. A lot of it was just picking the colors and the textures and letting things do what they do best. But now I'm going to go in there and shape that randomness a little bit to best complement the composition. So I want not just to have these black blotchy areas and color areas, but I want to meld them. I want to meld things and make my painted aspects look like the randomness of the texture, but it is actually very intentionally done and crafted. And that's the hard part, making this look like it happened by chance. left is this little lantern. And starting with some lemon yellow as a base. Blending that into the middle, which miraculously has somehow maintained white paper throughout all of this. And mixing in green gold, quin gold, and some more of that lemon yellow. More concentrated form to do the little details of this lantern. Bit of shading along the bottom with some bluish green. As well as along the top edge here. And shaping the cap of the lantern as well. Using this same bluish green for all of those bits of shading. A little hoop at the top for the string to attach to. And let's see, tiniest bit of quin pink, just for a little bit of darker shading along the tip here. I just realized that my lantern is kind of acorn shaped. I like that. And the final little bit is the string that the bird is using to hold this lantern, and I'm using Winsor red for that. Careful not to have the line too defined, because I have this blurred shadow of the head, so I don't want it to feel like the string is jumping out at you. It has to be a little bit more diffuse and blurred. There. And that is it. I am going to sign this picture in the top corner because there's not really much room in the dark colors at the bottom. And I don't want to distract from the compositional elements there. So yes, I do actually take thought to where I put my signature, because I don't want the signature to interrupt the flow of things. There we go. All done. This piece is going to be called Stealing Embers.